You think your life is falling apart. Plans collapse. Relationships crack. Your old motivations feel fake. You call it burnout, depression, failure. But what if what you are living through is not a breakdown, but a hidden stage of human evolution? What if this so-called dark night of the soul is not darkness at all, but the nervous system preparing for a different level of reality? In this video, I want to speak to you as directly as possible. No cliches, no soft comfort, and no mystical fog. Only a clear look at what happens when consciousness outgrows the story it has been living in. If you stay with me, I am going to show you why your worst psychological crisis may be the most precise signal that something in you is trying to be born. We have to start with a simple point that most people avoid. The mind is not designed for truth. It is designed for survival and social adaptation. From childhood, you construct a psychological operating system made of beliefs, habits, loyalties, and fears. It works well enough until it doesn't. The dark night of the soul begins when this operating system can no longer process the amount of reality you are encountering. Notice what usually gets called a dark night. You lose interest in things that used to drive you. The career ladder stops making sense. Your religious or philosophical framework feels hollow. You may feel detached from friends and family, not because you hate them, but because the conversations feel like acting. What is actually happening here is not random sadness. Your perception is quietly rebelling against a version of reality that no longer fits. Psychology has language for parts of this: identity crisis, cognitive dissonance, existential depression. But these labels often treat the experience as a malfunction. I am arguing something different. There are times when the discomfort is not a bug in the system, it is a sign that the whole system is being invited to update. The pain does not come from darkness, in some mystical sense. It comes from the friction between an old structure of self and a new, larger frame pushing from the inside. Think of how your brain normally operates. It constantly predicts what will happen next, what people will say, how events will unfold, who you are supposed to be in each situation. When reality starts violating these predictions at a deep level, the brain generates an error signal. At low levels, that just means surprise. At higher levels, when your core assumptions are challenged, that error signal shows up as anxiety, emptiness, or a sense that nothing is real. The dark night of the soul is a prolonged period where your prediction system is forced to admit its map no longer matches the territory. This is why the experience feels so disorienting. You are not just sad. You are losing faith in the filters you have been using to interpret existence. The narratives that kept you moving. If I do this, I will be happy. If I become that, I will be safe, are breaking down. The mind experiences that collapse as danger, but something in you is not interested in safety anymore. It is interested in contact with what is actually true. Let's be precise. The dark night of the soul is a restructuring process where consciousness withdraws energy from an outdated identity. Activities feel lifeless not because life lost value, but because the reward structures that used to manipulate you are losing their grip. You begin to see how much of your behavior was driven by fear of abandonment, fear of rejection, fear of insignificance. Once you see that clearly, you can no longer fully believe in the old game. This is where people often panic. They assume if the old motivations are dying and I have no new ones yet, then I am becoming nothing. I am falling into emptiness. In a way, that is accurate. But this emptiness is not a mistake. It is an in-between state. Human beings live inside social systems that do not recognize this dissolving as a stage of growth. Society can tolerate productivity, entertainment, and breakdown, but not deep inner transformation. So the first shift I want you to make is conceptual. Stop calling this period dark, as if it were a moral failure or a spiritual punishment. See it as what it actually is, a diagnostic alarm from your own consciousness. It is telling you the way you have been configured is no longer compatible with the deeper layers of reality you are starting to perceive. That is not bad news. It is uncomfortable, but it is a sign of movement. To understand this more clearly, we have to look at how identity is built. From early childhood, you learn to edit yourself. You discover which behaviors get you approval and which ones bring shame or punishment. Slowly, you assemble a mask, a public version of yourself that can survive in your family, your school, your culture. Over years, you start believing the mask is who you are. The dark night begins when the mask cannot contain the volume of your experience anymore. Maybe you have glimpses of this when you are alone, late at night. Your social media persona, your professional image, your role in the family, they all feel like costumes. You start noticing how much you say things you do not mean just to keep others comfortable. You see how your own values have been borrowed, not chosen. This realization is not pleasant. It can feel like betrayal in both directions. You feel betrayed by the world that trained you, and you feel like a traitor for no longer fitting into it. At this stage, many people distract themselves. They look for new entertainment, a new partner, a new job, or a new spiritual label. Anything to avoid sitting in the raw fact that they do not know who they are. But if you are actually in a dark night, distraction stops working. Everything that used to numb you loses its power. This is another sign that something deeper is happening. Your consciousness is refusing to go back to sleep. Here is where the dark reputation comes from. When the old identity is collapsing and the new one has not yet formed, you are left in a psychological gap. The meaning structures that used to orient you are offline. You may ask, what is the point of anything? This is not a trendy nihilism. It is a serious question from the system. If the previous reward matrix was false, what remains? That question is the doorway to rebirth. Now, let's talk about why this process is so often misdiagnosed. We live in a culture that worships constant positivity and functionality. If you cannot smile through your suffering and keep performing your assigned role, you are quickly labeled as broken. The pharmaceutical and self-help industries rush in with answers, fix the symptoms, restore your capacity to function, get you back to normal. But if normal itself is misaligned with reality, then returning to it is not healing, it is regression. I am not saying all psychological distress is a spiritual rebirth. Some people need medical help, immediate intervention, and stabilizing care. If your suffering is pushing you towards self-harm or psychosis, you should not romanticize it as enlightenment. You should seek support. But alongside clinical suffering, there is another category of crisis that has been almost completely ignored: the crisis of outgrowing the collective hallucination. By collective hallucination, I mean the shared story about what life is for. The script that says, be productive, consume, compete, distract yourself, fear death, and never question the frame. When a person begins to see through this script, the result is not instant bliss. It is often profound alienation. They realize that their culture is not built for conscious beings, it is built for obedient consumers. That realization can feel like a dark night because you are suddenly alone in a crowd. This alienation is painful, but it is also extremely intelligent. It shows that your nervous system is rejecting environments that are not compatible with a deeper level of awareness. The anxiety you feel in trivial conversations, the exhaustion you feel in shallow routines, these are not just weaknesses. They are signals. Your system is telling you that your time and attention are too valuable to be spent inside a dead narrative. The next shift is to understand the dark night as a reorganization of perception itself. In everyday life, most people see the world through a narrow tunnel: self versus others, success versus failure, pleasure versus pain. Inside that tunnel, everything is interpreted in terms of how it affects your little character. In a dark night, this tunnel begins to widen. You start noticing the impermanence of everything, the arbitrariness of your preferences, the fragility of your self-image. You also become aware that consciousness itself is not personal. This is a confronting insight. The sense of I, you defended for years turns out to be a temporary pattern in a larger field of awareness. Thoughts appear, emotions surge, identities shift, but the fact of being aware remains constant in the background. When this realization stops being a philosophical idea and becomes a lived perception, the old egoic structure cannot hold its authority. It begins to dissolve, and it calls that dissolving darkness. From the standpoint of that ego, yes, this is death. Its stories are dying. Its claim to be the center of the universe is being revoked, but from the standpoint of consciousness itself, this is a correction. Attention is being freed from a false center so it can participate in a wider reality. Rebirth does not mean becoming special or chosen. It means seeing clearly that you were never as solid, separate, or permanent as you believed. At this point, something interesting happens. The values that drove your life start to flip. External validation loses its importance. You are less interested in being seen as good, successful, or spiritual, and more interested in whether your actions are aligned with what feels fundamentally true. You become skeptical of your own motives. You begin to see how much of what you called love was actually control, how much of what you called spirituality was another performance. This self-interrogation can be brutal. It can feel like you are destroying everything. But what you are actually doing is refusing to carry illusions into the next phase. Rebirth is not the addition of new beliefs on top of old ones. It is the stripping away of what cannot stand under honest observation. The dark night is the audit. To navigate this audit without collapsing, you need a few practical understandings. First, do not confuse emptiness with meaninglessness. When your old frameworks fall apart, life can feel hollow, but that hollowness is space for new forms of understanding. If you rush to fill it with the next ideology, the next teacher, the next identity, you interrupt the process. The system needs time to deconstruct before it can accurately reconstruct. Second, understand that your nervous system is undergoing an intense process. Sleep patterns may shift, emotions may swing, attention may feel fragmented. This does not mean you are failing at awakening. It means your hardware is trying to run a new operating system. Support it. Take care of the body. Limit unnecessary stimulation. You are not obligated to maintain every social role while your inner architecture is being rewired. Third, resist the temptation to make permanent decisions from temporary instability. In the middle of a dark night, you may feel like ending relationships, quitting jobs, burning bridges, or announcing dramatic conclusions about life. Sometimes change is necessary, but realize that your perception is in a transitional state. The conclusions you draw now might not match the clarity that emerges later. Give yourself time whenever possible. Fourth, do not isolate into arrogance. A common trap during this stage is to believe everyone else is asleep, only I see the truth. That is just the ego putting on a new costume. Yes, you may see through certain social games more clearly. That does not make you superior. It makes you responsible for how you move now. Humility is not self-hatred. It is simply realism about how limited any one perspective is, including yours. If you look at human history, you can see a similar pattern at the collective level. Civilizations go through dark nights when their dominant worldview collapses. The Earth was once the fixed center of the cosmos, until it wasn't. Human beings were once seen as separate from nature, until ecological and evolutionary understanding disrupted that illusion. Each time, there was panic, denial, and resistance before a wider frame became normal. You, as an individual, are repeating that process in your own nervous system, the geocentric model of your life. The idea that your ego is the central point of reference is losing credibility. New data has arrived. Direct experiences of interconnectedness, glimpses of awareness beyond your personal story, a sense that reality does not revolve around your preferences. At first, this is terrifying, but over time, it becomes liberating. The dark night of the soul is the transition zone between terror and liberation. In that zone, you no longer fully believe in the old story, but you also do not yet have stability in the new one. You cannot go back, and you do not know how to go forward. This is the psychological equivalent of being between worlds. From the outside, it looks like depression. From the inside, it feels like being dismantled by an invisible intelligence. Call that intelligence whatever you like. Evolution, the unconscious, the self, the structure of reality itself. The label is not important. What matters is this: something in you is more committed to truth than to comfort. It will not let you settle for a life built entirely on distraction and pretense. It is willing to let your old self-image die so that a more accurate relationship with existence can emerge. What does rebirth look like in practical terms? It is not fireworks or constant bliss. It is a quiet but decisive shift in how you relate to your own experience. Pain still happens, but it is no longer your entire identity. Thoughts still appear, but you recognize them as events in consciousness, not ultimate commands. Success and failure still occur, but they do not define your worth. You move from being a hostage of your mind to being a participant in a larger field of awareness. With that shift, certain choices become obvious. You naturally stop feeding environments that require you to be unconscious. You lose interest in conversations that revolve only around status, gossip, or consumption. You become more sensitive to the quality of attention you are giving and receiving. You may simplify your life, not as a moral decision, but as a direct response to what feels authentically sustainable. This is where the dark night reveals itself as disguised preparation. Without the earlier collapse, you would never have questioned the structures that were quietly draining you. You would have continued to pursue goals that were not yours, uphold values you did not examine, and perform identities that never fit. The suffering forced you to ask questions you would not have asked otherwise. It forced you to see through your own performance. Rebirth also changes your relationship to death, not as an abstract concept, but as a daily reference point. You see that every identity is temporary, every role will end. Every story you tell about yourself will dissolve. Instead of using this as a reason for despair, you see it as permission. Permission to stop living as if your current script is the final word. Permission to experiment, to adjust, to prioritize what is real over what is respectable. You might notice that fear still arises, but its authority has weakened. The fear of disapproval, the fear of missing out, the fear of being misunderstood, they still speak, but they are no longer the final decision makers. A deeper orientation appears, a commitment to alignment with what you have discovered to be true, even when it is inconvenient. That is one of the clearest signs that the dark night has turned into rebirth. There is also a shift in how you see other people. You begin to recognize their masks without condemning them. You see the social games, the unconscious patterns, the inherited scripts, and instead of reacting with superiority, you feel a kind of sober compassion. You remember that you were, and still are, capable of the same sleep. This does not mean you tolerate abuse or nonsense. It means you understand the machinery behind it. From this perspective, even conflict takes on a different meaning. The people who challenge you, trigger you, or mirror your old patterns are no longer enemies to defeat. They are data. They show you where residues of the old self remain, where identification still clings. You use these interactions as feedback for your own clarity. In this way, the world becomes a continuous field of practice, not a battlefield of egos. So where does this leave us? If you are in the middle of what feels like a dark night of the soul, the point is not to romanticize it or to suffer proudly. The point is to understand what is actually occurring so you do not misinterpret a profound restructuring as mere failure. You are not obligated to enjoy it, but you are invited to cooperate with it, to stop fighting every signal, and to recognize that something more intelligent than your conscious plans might be at work. When you look back, often years later, you will see a clear before and after. Before, life was about defending an image and serving an external script. After, life becomes an ongoing inquiry into what is real, what is aligned, and what is worth giving your limited attention and energy to. The events of your dark night may not look glamorous from the outside, but internally they mark the end of one psychological era and the start of another. The title of this video calls the dark night Rebirth in Disguise. The disguise is convincing. In the middle of it, all you may see is loss of certainty, of identity, of old pleasures. But if you examine the process closely, you will notice that what is being removed is precisely what could not go with you into a more conscious way of living. The mask is what dies. The one who wore it becomes transparent to something larger. So if you are there now, if your life feels stripped, empty, or directionless, do not rush to fill the space with noise. Sit with the emptiness long enough to see what it actually is. Question the stories you have been handed. Watch the movements of your mind without assuming they define you. Support your nervous system, seek help when needed, and refuse to turn this process into a performance. The dark night of the soul is not darkness in the moral sense. It is the temporary blackout of an old operating system so that a more accurate one can emerge. Rebirth is not guaranteed. You can always choose to go back to sleep, to rebuild the same old structure with new decorations. But if you stay honest, if you let go of what is clearly false, and if you prioritize reality over comfort, then that so-called darkness reveals its actual nature. It was never against you. It was never a punishment. It was a demand for upgrade. And if you listen closely, beneath the confusion and the fear, you can sense it, not the voice of despair, but the quiet pressure of evolution, asking you one simple question. Are you willing to become more conscious than you were yesterday?